The first time I realized the life I was living didn't belong to me, it felt like a mistake. A temporary one. The kind you correct once you notice it. I told myself I had simply drifted a little off course. That happens to everyone. You compromise here, adjust there, take a detour you never planned, and one day you wake up slightly confused, but still in control. I believed that. Because the alternative was unbearable. The alternative was admitting that I hadn't just made a few wrong turns, I had been following someone else's map the entire time. I didn't choose my life the way people imagine choices are made. There was no single moment of decision. No dramatic fork in the road. There was agreement. Agreement with expectations. With suggestions. With what made sense to others. With what sounded reasonable when spoken out loud. I learned early that approval feels like safety. When people nod at your plans, when they say that's smart or that's the right move, something inside you relaxes. You feel held. So I followed the life that earned nods. Step by step, I accepted paths that didn't excite me but didn't scare me either. I chose stability over curiosity. Recognition over resonance. I became very good at living a life that looked right. I told myself I would make it mine later. Later became my favorite word. Later, when things settle. Later, when I'm more confident. Later, when I have the freedom to choose differently. Later is a comfortable lie. It doesn't demand proof. Years passed quietly. I built routines that fit the role I was playing. I learned how to perform competence, responsibility, reliability. I became someone people described with reassuring adjectives. Solid. Dependable. Put together. I learned how to nod at my own reflection and say, this is fine. What I didn't learn was how to feel present inside that reflection. I noticed it first in conversations. People asked me about my life, and I answered fluently facts, timelines, achievements. The words came easily. The meaning didn't. I spoke about myself as if I were reading a summary, not telling a story. I thought that was maturity. But maturity without alignment feels hollow. I realized I rarely used the word I in a personal way. I spoke in terms of obligations, structures, plans that existed independently of desire. I said things like, it makes sense, or it's logical, or this is what I'm supposed to do. Supposed to. That phrase carried my life. I told myself that everyone lives like this. That passion is overrated. That meaning grows slowly, after commitment. But something inside me remained untouched. Untouched long enough to start fading. I didn't hate my life. That was the most dangerous part. Hatred would have forced confrontation. Pain would have demanded change. What I felt was distance. Like I was inhabiting a well-furnished apartment that belonged to someone else, careful not to move anything, careful not to leave marks. I did what was required. I showed up, I fulfilled roles. I played my part convincingly enough that even I forgot it was a role. Until one night, standing in my bedroom, surrounded by photos that documented a life I recognized but didn't remember living, something shifted. I looked at those images, smiling faces, milestones, proof of continuity, and felt a strange grief. Not for what I had lost. For what I had never chosen. The realization didn't come as a scream. It came as a question: if no one had expected anything from me, would I still be here? That question had no immediate answer. But it exposed something I could no longer ignore. I had lived carefully. Responsibly. Correctly. But I had done it as a guest. My life had shape, structure, narrative, all the things that signal success. What it lacked was authorship. I hadn't written it. I had inherited it. And once that truth surfaced, every familiar thing started to feel slightly foreign. My routines. My goals. Even my future felt pre-written, like a continuation of a script I never auditioned for. I tried to dismiss the thought as exhaustion, as overthinking, as ingratitude. But it returned, quieter and heavier each time. I realized how often I had ignored my own resistance because it didn't come with a logical argument. How easily I dismissed discomfort when it couldn't be explained. I had trained myself to trust everything except my inner response. That training had worked. It had made my life functional. It had also made it feel borrowed. I wasn't lost. I was misplaced. Living a life that fit but didn't belong. And the scariest part was this, I didn't know where my own life was anymore. I only knew that if I didn't find it soon, the life I was living would eventually become permanent, not because I chose it, but because time would seal it in place. That night, sitting on the edge of my bed, suitcase untouched at my feet, I understood something I couldn't unlearn. I wasn't afraid of changing my life. I was afraid of discovering how long I had been absent from it. And once you see that absence clearly, staying becomes impossible to justify. After that night, I started paying attention to things I had learned to ignore. Not dramatically. Not bravely. Reluctantly. I noticed how often my days felt pre-approved. How rarely I asked myself what I wanted before responding to what was expected. My calendar looked full, but none of it felt authored by me. I realized I had become very good at adaptation. So good that I mistook it for identity. I adapted to people's needs. To systems. To routines that rewarded consistency more than honesty. Each adjustment felt small enough to justify. Together, they formed a life that functioned perfectly without my consent. I began to see how often I explained my choices in terms of logic, never desire. How quickly I dismissed impulses that didn't fit the narrative of who I was supposed to be. I had internalized a quiet rule: if it can't be explained, it shouldn't be chosen. That rule had kept me safe. It had also kept me distant. I noticed how uncomfortable I felt when someone asked me open-ended questions. Questions without right answers. What do you want? What matters to you? What would you do if nothing was holding you back? Those questions made my chest tighten. Not because I didn't care. Because I didn't know. I had lived so long inside external definitions that my internal voice felt unfamiliar. Weak. Easy to doubt. I trusted systems more than instincts. Plans more than reactions. Approval more than alignment. That trust had shaped my life. I saw how often I said yes automatically. How rarely I paused to feel whether something fit. My responses were efficient, polite, reliable. Empty. I realized that people didn't know me the way I thought they did. They knew the version of me that fit smoothly into their expectations. They knew my roles. My functions. My reliability. They didn't know my resistance. I didn't show it. Because resistance complicates things. It creates tension. Forces explanation. Risks disappointment. So I kept it hidden. And when resistance stays hidden long enough, it turns into numbness. I noticed that my emotional reactions had flattened. Things that once would have moved me now barely registered. I didn't feel extreme sadness, but I didn't feel deep joy either. I lived in the middle. That middle felt responsible. It also felt lifeless. I started to question moments I had always described as choices. When I looked closely, many of them weren't choices at all. They were defaults. Paths of least resistance. Options that required the least explanation. I had followed momentum. Momentum can carry you far. Just not necessarily where you belong. I realized how rarely I had stopped to ask whether a life that looked good from the outside felt inhabitable from the inside. How easily I had confused comfort with belonging. Belonging requires recognition. I didn't recognize myself anymore. I felt like a translation of myself, accurate in structure, incorrect in meaning. I began to sense a quiet grief. Not sharp enough to disrupt my life, but persistent enough to color everything. A grief for the person I might have been if I had trusted my own reactions instead of constantly correcting them. I remembered moments from the past, not regrets exactly, but divergences. Times when something in me had pulled in one direction and I had calmly, reasonably chosen another. At the time, those choices felt mature. Now, they felt cumulative. I wasn't facing one wrong decision. I was facing a pattern. A pattern of deferring myself. I noticed how often I said, "That's just how it is." How often I accepted constraints without questioning whether they were real or simply inherited. I had accepted limits that were never tested. And over time, those limits became walls. I tried to imagine what my life would look like if I stripped away everything I had chosen to satisfy others' expectations. What would remain if no one was watching, approving, evaluating? The image was unclear. That terrified me. Because it meant I didn't know myself outside of performance. I began to understand that living someone else's life doesn't feel like captivity. It feels like comfort. A comfort built on familiarity and validation. A comfort that dulls curiosity. A comfort that slowly replaces desire with obligation. I wasn't miserable. I was anesthetized. And anesthesia works quietly. It doesn't hurt while it's happening. You only notice it when you realize you haven't felt anything deeply in a long time. I realized that the life I was living had become self-sustaining. It didn't need my enthusiasm. It didn't need my belief. It only required my compliance. And I had given it willingly. I thought about how easy it would be to continue. To let this version of my life carry me forward without resistance. To age into it, explain it, defend it. That path was open. Wide. Effortless. That was the danger. Because ease had replaced truth as my compass. I began to see that the cost of continuing wasn't visible in any single day. It was visible in the slow disappearance of agency. In the way my life spoke about me instead of from me. In the way my future felt pre-written, not because it was inevitable but because I hadn't claimed authorship. I realized something essential then: I hadn't lost myself suddenly. I had outsourced myself. Decision by decision. Explanation by explanation. Until one day, I looked at my life and realized that while it was coherent, stable, and respectable, it wasn't mine. And the longer I stayed inside it, the harder it became to imagine how to leave without shattering everything I had built around this borrowed identity. That tension sat with me. Heavy. Unresolved. Because I was standing at the edge of a truth I could no longer deny: if I continued living this life, I would survive. But I would never arrive. Once I admitted that the life I was living wasn't mine, I expected urgency. Panic. A desperate need to escape. Some dramatic push that would force me to act. None of that came. What came instead was stillness. A heavy, unmistakable stillness that made it impossible to keep pretending. I realized that borrowed lives don't collapse. They continue. Smoothly. Efficiently. Quietly. That's what makes them dangerous. They don't punish you for staying. They reward you with comfort, approval, and a sense of belonging that doesn't require authenticity. I could have stayed forever. That was the problem. The more I thought about leaving, the clearer something became: nothing external was stopping me. There were no chains. No ultimatums. No dramatic obstacles. Only history. Only momentum. Only the fear of admitting that I had invested years in a life I never consciously chose. Leaving wouldn't just change my future. It would rewrite my past, because once you admit that you were living someone else's life, you have to confront the grief of all the moments when you felt something pull inside you and calmly ignored it. That grief was heavier than fear. I mourned versions of myself that never had a chance to exist. Not because they were impossible, but because I never gave them permission. I realized how often I had confused being reasonable with being alive. How easily I had dismissed discomfort as immaturity. How quickly I had learned to distrust anything in me that couldn't be defended logically. That distrust had shaped everything. I had become fluent in justification and illiterate in desire. I stopped asking what made sense. I started asking what felt honest. That shift was terrifying. Honesty doesn't come with instructions. It doesn't align neatly with expectations. It doesn't protect you from judgment. And it doesn't guarantee success. The first honest decision I made felt almost absurd in its simplicity. It wasn't dramatic. It didn't impress anyone. It didn't change my life overnight. But it was mine. And that changed everything. For the first time in years, I felt friction inside myself, not resistance, but engagement. The sensation of choosing without knowing how it would turn out. That sensation was unfamiliar. It was also alive. I began to see how much of my exhaustion had come from self-suppression. From constantly editing myself to fit a life that wasn't built around my voice. From translating my impulses into acceptable forms until they lost their original meaning. I stopped translating. Not all at once. But enough. Some people didn't understand. Some relationships shifted. Some expectations dissolved when I stopped reinforcing them. That hurt. But the pain felt clean. It wasn't the dull ache of erasure. It was the sharp sensation of re-entry. I learned something essential in that process: living someone else's life doesn't feel like lying. It feels like being useful. Being approved. Being safe. But safety without authorship becomes a cage you decorate until you forget it's locked. I didn't need to destroy my life to reclaim it. I needed to stop defending it. Stop explaining why it made sense. Stop justifying why I stayed. Stop protecting a narrative that excluded me. Once I did that, something quiet but irreversible happened. My life stopped speaking about me. It started speaking from me. Not perfectly. Not confidently. But truthfully. I don't pretend that everything is clear now. Clarity is overrated. What I have instead is alignment, imperfect, unstable, constantly demanding attention. But it's real. If you're listening to this and something in you recognizes that distance, that sense of living a life that fits but doesn't belong, I want you to hear this without drama. You don't need permission to reclaim authorship. You don't need a crisis to justify change. And you don't need certainty to stop living on borrowed terms. The cost of staying isn't always visible. Sometimes it's paid quietly, in years that pass without your voice in them. I didn't lose my life by making the wrong choice. I almost lost it by never choosing at all. Now, I choose differently. Not because I know where I'm going. But because I finally know who's walking there. And after years of living a life that made sense to everyone else, living one that feels true, uncertain, unfinished, undeniably mine, is the only thing that no longer feels like a compromise. It feels like arrival. Not at a destination, but into myself.